Hey, Gary here. Welcome to Book Mob episode 29. Now, today I want to talk about a great book, a history book that is the mother of all books to read. It's over 1,500 pages, and it was published in 1960 by William L. Shirer, who was a journalist working in Nazi Germany from the 30s up until December 1940. The book is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's a mammoth task. And why would you be interested in reading this book? Well, because it's narrative history. Look, this is being criticised, by scholars and academics. It's not a scholarly book, but it is indeed a very, very in-depth narrative history of a most poisonous time in 20th century human history. And again, William L. Shirer was on the ball from, I think it was in Germany from 1930, before Hitler came to power, up until December 1940, when he had to escape Berlin because we had to escape Germany because he was told by an inside source in the Reichstag that the Gestapo were coming to get him, to arrest him as a spy. Now, anyone in Berlin who wasn't a German, wasn't a Nazi, and particularly if you were a foreign journalist, you were automatically a spy. And up until then, the war had only been engaged, with European powers, and America was still sitting on the outside. However, America was tactically involved in helping blockade the North Sea, helping the British with war materials. German submarines sunk many American merchant ships before they were officially at war. There were scenes where American battleships got into trouble. And so there was a Cold War going on, a cold physical war going on between America and the Nazis before the official declaration of war. However, William L. Shirer, being a foreign correspondent, and he, was at the birth of this poisonous and the most sort of evil empire that the 20th century had given birth to, and he had a front side seat. I mean, he knew, he knew them as a journalist, not as they weren't friends. I mean, he had spoken to Hitler, he had spoken to Goebbels, he had met people in the high echelons of the Nazi government. So he had a microscopic look at what was going on, and many times particularly during the later 30s and into the war, which started in September 39, Shirer had many opportunities to break German law by corresponding via radio on events that were happening on the ground at the time. So he was well ahead of the game when it came to corresponding and taking, being a journalist and getting the story out. In fact, Shirer actually went with the German Wehrmacht as they moved west into Belgium and Holland and France and Norway and Denmark. So he had first-hand knowledge of the early stages of the Nazi successes in Western Europe. And he, many times he got into trouble because he was sending out stories, so they would close down the telegraph system. They would make life difficult for him, because I think they always knew, or the German hierarchy always knew, that this man Shirer was going to be an enemy. It just was a matter of time. So it was a very, very touchy and sensitive time for journalists to be in the thick of it. Also, this book was published in 1960, and when it came out, of course, it caused a bit of controversy, particularly the cover art, particularly because of the sensitivity of, this is 1960, so, less than 20 years after the end of the war. It was still very, obviously because of the Nazi party's, war of hate around the globe, that people felt that you shouldn't really put this symbol on front of a cover of a book. But Shirer stood his ground saying, look, this is a history about an evil empire, and people have got to know, just because you have the symbol here, it does not reflect it reflects the history inside. Originally, the title of the book was Hitler's Nightmare Empire. Sounds a bit Star Warsy to me, but I think because of the nature of this is a narrative history. So he wants people to know exactly when they open this book. It's not about Hitler. It's not about the personality. It's about the Third Reich. It's about the government. It's about the people. It's about the battles. It's about the tragedies. It's about the atrocities. So it covers everything that this government, this most, I guess the most evil government ever produced in 20th century human history. And so, like I said, it's over 1,500 pages. And okay, I'm a reader. I originally bought this book in 1990. This is a 1985 or 37th printing in that year. So this book has been on sale since 1960 and is still selling like hotcakes. And because it is so well written, and even though the academic critique of the book is very, it can't be studied, so to speak, as an analysis of the Nazis. It's more Shirer has gone out of his way to read millions of documents, and he, obviously with his researchers, and he's tried to condense, how many years was it? 1933 to 45. He's trying to condense all that history into a sizable, practical, enjoyable narrative. And he does it. I mean, it's a successful book. I mean, I stay away from ideas that, it's not scholarly because, it wasn't written to be a scholarly book. He wanted people, I just think in 1960, millions of people who had gone through the war, obviously this was their first opportunity to actually see and feel and have and reflect on their own experiences, their own personal experiences of the war. Because he covers, he covers, I'm talking about the European war, not the Second World War, it's the Third Reich war. And Shirer got into a whole lot of trouble before, during, and after the war. And again, he was obviously someone who could take, a complicated, complex issue and dial it down. It's still a very tough book to read. Don't get me wrong. It's not an easy read. And I would say that, like on this reading, it took me how many days? It took me 11 days to read this time. And the way I suggest that you read this book, if you want to, and I highly recommend reading narrative history because it's a great way to find out about the world, and it leads to so many other places where you can find things you like. Now, I would suggest that if you go through the book and say to yourself, this is a goal you can set yourself, to have achieved it. And I would suggest, for an in-depth read, is 100 pages a day. You'll get it through in 2 weeks or so. You could probably go to 40, 50 pages a day. But the reason I say that you've got to stay on top of it is because it's very complex and it's very exciting, and it's a page turner as well because of the way he describes his insights, his information that he had from the inside itself, how he found out things about what was going on in the government. And it's a very broad picture of a complicated government scenarios. But at the same time, he tries to understand that the average punter out there just wants to enjoy reading history and not have to be bogged down in, tons and tons of stats and tons of analytical of how many tomatoes were eaten and how many bullets were made. He's trying to say that, this is history on the go. I was there for a part of it. I saw and I met these people. I mean, he's got a relationship with a professional journalistic relationship with Goebbels, even met Hitler. So he was going to, like, before the war began, as like in any foreign country where foreign journalists are around, they go to cocktail parties, they go to lunch, they have inside sources. So you can imagine that, I always think of, when I think of the Third Reich, you just think of this big block of evil, and you don't think of all the people inside, and they're individuals. They're people who want to help. There are people who know what's going on, and the best way for them at this time was to give information and access to journalists who would spread the word. So obviously with the implementation of of how suddenly, when in 1933, even though the Jewish population, were being taken advantage of and sent off to camps, even before Germany really became fully Nazified. But a lot of Jews were able to give information and get themselves out of Germany, and they took that through journalists as well, who would help them, get out of the country. So it's not a spy novel. It's a concise, dry, but entertaining history of one of the most tumultuous times in 20th century history. And Shirer, when I think about it, Shirer, as I said, he was able to be with the Wehrmacht as they invaded Western Europe. So this journalist is being with German soldiers, going through Holland, going through Belgium, going through France, Denmark, Norway, and he's basically experiencing the Second World War as a journalist from the side that only months later, or a year or so later, he would be obviously on the opposing side. Now, after 19, he left. He had to leave hurriedly, obviously, because he was going to be arrested and executed. Shirer, that was, and he returned to the States, and he only returned to Germany in 1945 for the Nuremberg trials at the end of the war. And again, he uses a lot of that information as a kind of way to highlight the narrative, what was going on before 1945, from 33 to 45. So Shirer is a very unique individual. He was a very well-known radio personality at his time, and he had a couple of problems. And I think he wrote the book more as he wrote the book because he wanted to, but I think he was driven by the fact that he was getting iced out of the communications industry and journalism as a whole back in the United States. So he sat down to write this fabulous, very well thought out history of the Third Reich. So I would hope that for people who've never attempted such a mammoth task, might say to themselves, how can I read this? I've got this, I've got my kids, I've got a job, I've got work, I've got study. And you don't want to read something that's taxing, but this is not taxing, this is interesting. It gives you a bird's eye view of a period of history. And like I said, it's a task that you've got to set yourself, but I think it's one of the seminal texts of 20th century history. And I really do believe that it'll still be being sold in 50 years from excuse me, will still be sold in 50 years from now. Anyway, so that was the William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. In here, in actual fact, one of the weird facts was Hitler had this problem. He used to have fits of rage. And one of his responses to rage was to throw himself down. And can you imagine, he's doing this in front of his generals and that, throw himself down on the floor, and he would pick up the end of a carpet and bite it and try and, and I thought, is that, and that's in here. So it mentions it. He was also a mega vegan. Hitler only got drunk once in his life in 1905, and he decided, now that's enough for me. He loved animals and he loved children, and at the same time, he was this beast of a human, this ugly personality that basically was, I guess, he was completely insane for most of his life. And Shirer did meet him. So look, there's tons and tons of interesting facts. There's also a nice, smooth way to find out about the war in Europe from 1939 to 1945. And I highly recommend it as a narrative history, not a scholarly history. It's not an academics book, but it might feel like an academics book because of its density and its length. But at the same time, it's fun to read, and it's very hard to get people to sit down and read something of this proportion, considering I'm always talking about how media, how video games and movies and YouTube and TikTok are all vying for your time. Just think what part of your brain is going to be working if you get through this. And I guarantee you will feel good after you finish it. And anyway, that was a wonderful read. It's my 5th or 6th reading that I've done of this book. And did I mention I bought this in Dallas, United States, when I did a cross-country Greyhound bus tour across coast to coast, and I stopped. But I didn't read it until about 1995, 96. But I've read it about 5 or 6 times since then, and I highly recommend it. Great book, great history, well worth the time, well worth the effort. And Book Mob says, read this book. All right, just before we go, I finished Stephen King's new book, Holly, this weekend. Look, great story. I really love the story, but man, does he go heavy on the COVID and the vaccinations and the Trump derangement. But it's a great story, really well written, lovely book, and again another great book from Stephen King. And I finished Anthony Burgess' The Wanting Seed. Again, this book talks about, this is written in the 60s, talking about a sort of dystopian world in the future, and kind of when you listen and read this, you go, we're pretty close to it. I read Marple, 12 new stories of the Agatha Christie. I was very disappointed. I mean, look, what did I expect? It's good stories, but I thought they should have been a bit more experimental. But a lot of them kind of were very lame and low key. But a good book for a train trip or a plane trip. And I'll be reading this week Wifedom by Anna Funda. She wrote Stasiland, which is just brilliant. Stasiland is such a fantastic book. And this is about George Orwell's wife and her place in his life. And also I bought this because I thought there's a new Agatha Christie film. This is the published as Halloween Party. That was the original title, and now it's called A Haunting in Venice. So that I'll be reading this week. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and if you like and subscribe, I appreciate it. If you want, you can just leave any comments, and feel free to contact me if you want me to talk about books that you've read or books that you want to read or any ideas for recommending for reading. All right, thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time. Bye.